Only in America.
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 Welcome to Only in America. I'm Ali Nirani. This week, what political polarization means for the idea of America.
In many ways, the American story is, I think, undoubtedly getting more diverse and more complex. And in many ways, I think that's a great thing. But what's needed for the story to cohere as a shared American story is some sense of unity about what is that central unifying idea and ideals. And I think part of our story has been we do debate it and contest it, and it can get very vigorous, but it needs to stay peaceful. And so a recommitment to that, I think, is actually a really important part of making the next chapter of the American story.
From the National Immigration Forum, I'm Ali Nirani. When our nation's founders put forth their vision of America, they couldn't have imagined the technological advances, the economic growth, or the social changes that make the United States what it is today. As the U.S. continues to become a richer, more diverse society, it's no surprise that we experience growing pains and identity crises along the way. Struggles for justice are woven into our history. The idea of America and who gets to participate in it has been challenged over and over as Americans fought for their rights as women, as racial minorities, and as immigrants. The fact is that the idea of America is constantly evolving. That's part of what makes it so remarkable and why we can't take it for granted. While challenges to American identity and unity are not unprecedented, today's polarized landscape makes a civil discourse difficult, but all the more important. Once again, frankly, we are at a point in history when we ask ourselves, what does it mean to be American? And how do we embrace all the different ways to be an American while uniting around shared values? How we answer these questions today will have an incredible impact on the generations of tomorrow.
Support for the National Immigration Forum comes from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, supporting innovations in education, democratic engagement, and strengthening international peace and security. And from Humanity United. When humanity is united, we can bring a powerful force for human dignity.
There are those who use the intersection of faith and politics to polarize the United States. Then, there are those who work day and night, from the pinnacles of power to the pews across America, to shape leaders and restore civility. Cherie Harder is one of those truly remarkable people working at the intersection of faith and politics to make us, as a country, less polarized. As president of the Trinity Forum, Harder works to create a more meaningful and civil national conversation through spiritual and character formation. Or, as the Trinity Forum puts it, connecting thinking leaders with leading thinkers. Cherie and I spoke about the challenge of finding unifying forces that bind us together as Americans, especially amid these days of increased polarization. She phrased the questions facing our nation perfectly. Who do we think we are? What do we think we're here for? And how do we figure it out together? And at the end of the day, what does all of that look like?
I grew up in a Christian household. Faith has always been very central to me, and something you think a lot about. You think very seriously about, what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus? How does this make a difference in your life? I was one of those annoying high school debaters, and so was also interested in, ideas and how they played out. And so after I graduated from college, I had thought it would be interesting to come to Washington, D.C. and maybe work on Capitol Hill for a year or two. I had participated in Girl State, and that had certainly ignited some interest in the project of governance. How, in a sense, we the people figure out how to order ourselves and order society and try to do that in a way that, was both just and allowed for human freedom and flourishing. And, I thought that, as many problems as the United States had, and certainly there were very many, a lot had gone right. And it's a really remarkable thing in human history to have, a country that was at peace, enjoyed remarkable prosperity, took an interest in justice despite all the injustices that occurred. And I was enough of a geek that was intensely interesting to me. Mm-hmm. So I came to D.C. after college, worked on Capitol Hill for a few years, worked at a think tank called Empower America, which was Jack Kemp, Gene Kirkpatrick, and Bill Bennett's think tank. Went back and forth on the Hill and federal agencies and that sort of thing. And one of the things that I think had always really interested me is, essentially how do you make an argument for, how do you persuade for what you think the right course of action is? And, people are motivated for different reasons. And certainly one of the things that both motivated me and motivated many of the people I talked to was, both a view of human nature, a view of what makes for a just society, how we're formed, what makes for a good person and a good life. Those questions all sort of intersect. So in a way, that's a very big picture, abstract point of view, but a lot of it comes down to, who do we think we are? What do we think we're here for? How do we figure it out together and order ourselves? And what does that look like when the rubber meets the road? So in some ways, that's sort of how I think I came as a person of faith to be really interested in sort of the public and political spheres. I should say I was always more of a policy wonk than a campaign person. I was always much more interested in sort of the ideas than the battlefield.
Mm-hmm. I read one of the pieces you have on the website, The Ties That Free. In the piece, you write about the sense of totalitarianism that feels like it's coming over the country, the world. But in that way, the role of institutions. Mm. Could you unpack what you just said earlier about,
Sure.
How people are ordering themselves and what's the role of institutions in that way?
Right. Well, that is a big question. The piece I wrote called The Ties That Free, really, a lot of these aren't original ideas. A lot of this goes back to Tocqueville.
Right.
And of course, when Tocqueville was traveling, the country back in the 1830s, and he wrote Democracy in America, which is basically sort of a travel log of what he saw.
It's the best travel writing ever.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Really incredible. He came here basically to study the penal system and wound up, writing the world's best travelogue. But, incredibly astute observer. And one of the things he noticed that was so different from what he had experienced before is that our country had all these little organizations, almost like both institutions, but often mini institutions too. Networks that kind of became more solidified, that were organized around a common purpose. People basically got together and decided something needed to be done, and they organized themselves and did it. And it seemed to happen both so often and, really relatively well, that it was one way, in a way that America got built, aside from a central planner, the heavy hand of government. There was a lot of freedom for people to do that. Now, of course, that's also can be used for ill. That's not an unmixed good. It's more of a tool than always a virtue. But what tended to happen is that by working together, people got a lot of things done, and then they tried to make sure those efforts lasted, so that it wasn't just a task or a friendship group or a clique. It actually became an institution, an organization of people who basically made sure that association and those purposes endured over time. And with any institution, it depends on a shared set of norms and values. You essentially can't compel all that needs to be compelled from unwilling people. It's, I think, what Edmund Burke called obedience to the unenforceable. There has to be a shared set of values, of norms, of behaviors, and the like. And one of the things Tocqueville noticed is that this often produces a much, both more liberty, better order, more justice, and more connection than you experience with a much heavier-handed authority, for example, or whether it's in a monarchy or even a tyranny. And so one of the things I mentioned in that piece is that this is an idea of not just Tocqueville, but one of the more modern political philosophers who really kind of looked at it from a very different vantage point was Hannah Arendt. Her work, The Origins of Totalitarianism. And of course, there's lots of different feeders and factors. But one of the things that she noticed is a requirement, a precondition of tyranny and ultimately totalitarianism is a breakdown both of institutions and of connections between people. That totalitarianism isn't possible for a people with robust sets of relationships and associations and institutional affiliations. People have to be divided and alienated and atomized in order for tyranny to happen, for totalitarianism to start. So, one of the most important things that institutions do, and this is certainly not a blanket endorsement of all institutions. There have been unjust and even evil institutions, of course, but the associations, the networks, the opportunities for action outside of state compulsion is essential to any kind of free or just society.
So then, as the country has diversified because of immigration, right? So, 1965 Immigration Nationality Act, really, I think, began to change the country in a pretty dramatic fashion, right? I mean, that's in large degree why I'm here. What are the challenges then to institutions, much less the remarkableness of America?
Right, yeah. Well, in many ways, I think the biggest challenges to institutions are less demographic than they are cultural. There have been other immigration waves, of course, in America's history. And really many of those immigration waves started, they catalyzed a lot of some of the nation's most important institutions. Whether it was the Irish or the Italians or the Greeks, it started a lot of different institutions, in the early 20th century that remain and endure to this day. And there are many of the same tensions, that happen, that many of the same fault lines and arguments and a lot of the same ugliness then. So really, I think one of the biggest challenges is not the fact that we have more immigrants coming in, but rather, do we have the same kind of unifying values and forces that bind us together? And there's been a lot written, said, studied about essentially the forces of polarization and atomization that are pulling us apart. And not just pulling us apart, but in many ways alienating us. So we're not only polarized, we're increasingly fragmented. We spend more time with our technology than we do with people. And all of those, I think, are far more corrosive to the health of institutions and relational networks as well than demographic change alone.
So then how do we help people understand that? Because I think right now, and this, I don't, by no means do it, I think both Democrats and Republicans do this. I think both parties are using demographic and cultural change to advance their agenda, right? And are leading people to blame the other.
Yes.
Right. So how do we help people and communities understand that it's not the other? It's kind of it's the phone that we're holding in our hand.
Yeah, we've met the enemy and he's us.
Yeah.
It's a big challenge because in many ways I think most people at their core want to have those kind of relationships, that kind of understanding. It's also, there's so many short-term incentives in favor of instrumentalizing, monetizing, weaponizing difference. And as I'm sure you well know, in politics, fear and loathing tends to drive donations, clicks, attention, voting, and the like. People are motivated by often, it's the instincts that have to do with self-preservation. And one of the easier things for campaigns to do is to try to push those buttons because there is just so much short-term payoff. You will get more donations, you will get more attention, you will get more media coverage, you'll get more votes often. So part of the problem is the long-range incentives are often, and the long-range good, for the country is at odds too often with the short-range incentives for the next election. And I don't know, I wish I had here's the answer. Here are the three things that must be done. My concern and my sense is that I don't know that it's something that can be dealt with quickly, that's easily scalable, that can be implemented on a mass level and, presto bingo, we're there. I think a lot of it is really the hard work of relationship building. Yeah. That's necessarily personal, that's over time, that's inherently messy. Anytime you really get to know someone, there's always, at some point, friction or misunderstanding or what have you. But you do that with your loved ones, with your family, with your neighbors, with your friends. And that's part of what makes life worth living. So I think part of what it's going to require is just, a more personal and sustained commitment, to that kind of both personal and civic relationship building.
How do we help people understand, okay, this immigrant that you've gotten to know through your church, your school, civic association, is no different from the one that you see on television?
Right.
So, that seems to be the challenge.
Well, one small step. Well, I say this is a small step. Actually, it's a simple step, but it's not small. And I don't know that it's going to happen. I really think it would be different if we read more and watched less. And part of the reason for that is, well, first of all, it engages very different parts of the brain. We're much more easily manipulated by image in some ways. And it can be done much more quickly. It can be done on a much more scalable level. Reading necessarily involves different parts of the brain. It's usually, or at least often, more complex. With any good novel, there's character development, and any good novel requires empathy to read it well, which is different from easily manipulatable images. So one step, I think, which I don't hear many people talking about, but I actually think if we were more of a reading culture, it would be easier to do that. But we have become so much a culture that's built around electronic media that it becomes harder. To your bigger point, I think one thing that often isn't emphasized enough is just how much comes out of friendships like that. Friendships with people who aren't exactly like you. And there do seem to be some people who are just naturally oriented towards, they're more curious, don't feel as threatened, and some of that might be an individual difference. But one experience I had, I grew up in a small town in northern New Mexico, essentially rolled off a mountain and found myself at Harvard as an undergrad. And, it was a huge culture shock for me. I'd gone to public school, had never heard of crew, didn't know what a lacrosse stick was, all those kind of things. My last 3 years of college there, one of my roommates was the president of Campus Crusade. The other was the president of the Harvard Civil Liberties Union. And we agreed on very little, but we were very close friends. And in many ways, it was one of the best parts of my education because we actually respected each other. And I think she was much smarter than I was. I was probably more glib, being an obnoxious high school debater. So we would talk way into the night about well, why is it that you think this? Help me understand. And when you actually take the desire to dominate somebody else out of it, and are just trying to be help me understand why you think this. You may not be convinced at all. You may not convince them. But you actually wind up, knowing far more, understanding far more, and in many ways feeling like your world has gotten both richer and bigger. And it was an eye-opening experience, for me. I feel like I learned an extraordinary amount from her. I think we probably changed each other's minds on a few things. Probably not on much. But also learned just how much of where we wound up made sense given where we had started, and how, personal experiences, even at a very early age, does affect one's view of the world and, some of one's assumptions, which are often rarely examined unless someone else kind of pokes at them.
But you bring up something important there because I think, when you say, somebody's poking at your assumptions, I also think it's important that we have to poke at our own assumptions.
Yeah.
Particularly in the immigration context.
Yes.
So how would you apply that conversation of kind of sitting down and helping me explain to that sitting across the table with somebody who says, you know what, I don't think we need immigrants in the U.S. Mm-hmm. Is there a way that conversation should be happening, I guess?
First of all, I don't know that those conversations will happen unless there's a certain amount of trust to start with. It's hard to have a conversation if people are only in transmit mode. There has to be at least some curiosity, interest in hearing, listening, and understanding. And if there's a relationship, usually there is. And one would hope anyway. Otherwise, it's, not the most pleasant of relationships. Well,
that's, again, a different podcast.
And in many ways, I do think that there may be some link between just sort of the atomization, of American society and, some of the attitudes, towards immigration. I mean, I think it's certainly, entirely possible, to basically be convinced, look, securing the borders are essential. There has to be, strong borders, a sound policy that's, firmly enforced. But fear, and anger, that's something different. That's not just a policy conviction. There's something else going on there. And, an alienated, atomized, isolated, and lonely America is by definition going to be a more fearful and angry America, a more suspicious America. And I think in many ways, what Tocqueville talked about, the genius of America being, this robust civil society, as, that has in some ways atrophied. As we've reported more loneliness and more disconnection, it's not hard to draw some connections between that and our growing fearfulness and anger towards what's perceived as the other.
What's the role of the faith community in addressing that fear and anger and atomization when it comes to immigration?
Right. Well, I don't know if I can say specifically for immigration, but in part of the role of the faith community is we worship a God who is love, who talks about how perfect love drives out fear. That love of God and love of neighbor, none of us are perfect, and we're all human, but generally wishing the good of your neighbor, wanting their good, wanting their flourishing, that will crowd out some fear. It may not change your mind on a particular policy matter, but it will make a big difference in whether you view your neighbor with, fear and anger, or you're oriented towards their good. And, our faith is about loving the Lord your God with all your mind, heart, soul, and strength, and loving your neighbor. And of course, it's more complex than that, but, that's how Jesus boiled it down. And, one could basically camp on those two commandments, for eternity, really, to unpack them. But anger and fear and reflexive distrust is not something that should be a characteristic of our faith, which calls us to go ever deeper into loving wisely and well.
Given the fear and the anger and the stresses on institutions at a local level, along with the cultural change that we're all struggling with in one way or another, how has the idea of America changed?
Ooh.
And that's not even the last question.
Dang. Now, I don't know how to encapsulate an answer to the question, how has the idea of America changed? One of the essential aspects, I think, of the idea of America, at least, historically understood, and again, all the caveats, the idea of America has been contested. There are people who basically question whether the idea was always an illusion, so, want to fully acknowledge that. But I do think, part of the idea of America was that regardless of, race or tribe or country of origin, that there was a certain American creed, a set of principles and values, ideas and ideals that defined and united Americans. That essentially, unlike so many nations which were defined by ethnicity or by language or only by geography, that what brought Americans to America, to become Americans, were a certain set of ideas and ideals, which included, self-government, constitutionally protected rights and liberties, grounding of those rights and liberties in the idea that man is made in the image of God. And so those rights and those liberties are inherent, intrinsic. They're not granted by the state, or by the ruler, nor can they be taken away. And because we have been endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, therefore the function of our government should look a certain way, and the ways we interacted with each other as citizens, that there were certain responsibilities of that. And obviously that leaves a lot of room for interpretation and a lot of room for debate, but it also provides a pretty a literally revolutionary framework for the country starting, and which has been worked out with often great violence, such as the Civil War, often a lot of civic and civil unrest, but often with a pointing back to what those ideals were. Not too long ago, I reread the Seneca Falls Convention Statement, which came out in 1848. It is really remarkable in that it basically takes the Declaration of Independence, goes through it, and says, here's how you have failed us. Here's how you failed to live up to these ideals. And, those ideals, I think, were the lodestone for abolitionists, for so many reformers, to basically try to push the country towards a better realization of them. Now, there's counter arguments. Again, that interpretation is contested, and want to fully acknowledge that. But I do think there is a lot of truth there. And with all of our challenges and problems and setbacks, I remain one of those citizens excited and inspired by the fact that we're a nation conceived with certain, in many cases not realized at all, ideals, but set those forth. So how do we then, in this day and age, with the new challenges that we have, what's the idea of America? In many ways, I think one of our big challenges is that those ideas and ideals need to be, if anything, I think more widely taught, more widely debated. There needs to be more wrestling with them. One of the concerns is that people often don't seem fully aware of them or what they mean. And, there's plenty of anecdotal studies about millennial or Gen Z misunderstandings. There are times I've heard members of Congress say things where you think like, wait, what? Members of Congress talking about how they report to the president, and you're like, no, that's, that is exactly not what you do. I forget who it was. One of the ancient Greek playwrights said that for any play, any story, the greater the diversity of plot and character, the greater the central unity you needed for it to all cohere and hang together. And, in many ways, the American story is, I think, undoubtedly getting more diverse and more complex. And in many ways, I think that's a great thing. But what's needed for the story to cohere as a shared American story is some sense of unity about what is that central unifying idea and ideals. And I think part of our story has been we do debate it and contest it, and it can get very vigorous, but it needs to stay peaceful. And so a recommitment to that, I think, is actually a really important part of making the next chapter of the American story.
Yeah. And it's kind of that lived experience. If it's reflected in a national story, then it feels like it all hangs together.
That's right.
So now I have the last question for you, and this is easily the hardest.
Okay, oh, great.
Really built the expectations here. So the name of the podcast is Only in America.
Okay.
So if you could finish this sentence, Only in America, ...
Oh. What did you answer when someone asked you that?
It's my podcast. I don't have to answer that question.
Well, in many ways, I think like only in America can a girl in rural New Mexico wind up with some of the opportunities I've had. I feel blessed and grateful.
Cherie Harder is the president of the Trinity Forum. I left our conversation with a greater sense of hope about our nation's future. This week, she joins us at our annual convening, Leading the Way, an American approach to immigration. She's going to be joining a discussion with author Michael Ware and Dr. Russell Moore of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention. You can find more information on Cherie, the Trinity Forum, and how to tune in to Leading the Way at our website, immigrationforum.org. And while you're there, do me a solid. Subscribe to Only in America and leave us a review. Only in America is produced and edited by Emily Chow, Joanna Taylor, and Megan Wetmore. And let me take a second to thank Kathleen Farrell, our executive producer and communications director of the National Immigration Forum, who just left us last week for future endeavors with the Sisters of Mercy. I'm Ali Nirani. Thank you for listening to Only in America, and I will talk to you next week.